Hey everybody, my name is Malashir. Welcome back to Sakura Seraph. Today I want to talk about something that a lot of people have been talking about for a few weeks now, OneD&D, and what it means for the future of the D&D community at large. Now, the first thing I want to say is while Wizards of the Coast has asked for feedback on playtest material before, usually released in the form of their Unearthed Arcana documents, this is the first time they've really asked for feedback on a full edition 2 years prior to its release. So it seems like they're really setting themselves up to listen to the feedback of the community from both the DM and the player side and take that into account with OneD&D or whatever it ends up becoming called. And I have a couple of thoughts on it. I haven't actually looked at the playtest material myself. I haven't had the time to, but I did watch a couple of YouTube videos for some other bigger YouTubers who have taken a look at the documents and given their thoughts on both the content in the playtest material as well as the virtual tabletop that OneD&D is being released alongside. So I kind of want to go over what my thoughts are so far on OneD&D. Specifically, I'm going to be mostly talking about 3 different YouTube videos that I watched. The first one being the Dungeon Dude's response video to OneD&D and what they're kind of expecting it to become and what they think of the materials that have been released so far. I do agree with them that calling them origins or ancestry instead of races is a really good idea, just because that gets rid of a lot of problematic language that isn't necessarily PC. That's honestly a very minor issue as far as OneD&D goes, just because the content that they were producing for 5e before they announced this release was already kind of doing that. However, I do have mixed feelings about what they're doing with the backgrounds. So it used to be that the ability score increases that you got from creating your character came from what race or ancestry you chose. So if you choose an elf, you get +2 to dexterity, and then if you're a high elf, you get +1 to intelligence, wood elf is +1 to wisdom, and drow is +1 to charisma. That's no longer the case. Now, your ability score increases are going to come from what background you choose. Now, I don't completely hate this change, because if you are, for example, if you are an orc acolyte. As an acolyte, you're going to have training in religious texts, and you're going to be a little bit wiser than other orcs of your tribe might be. But the racial traits that an orc gets don't reflect this. They get a bonus to their strength, and they get a bonus to their constitution. Even an orc cleric, by average stats, is no wiser or smarter than a standard orc. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, so I do like what they're doing here. However, there are certain things, certain physical traits that should factor into that ability score improvement. For example, no matter what you do, I personally feel that an orc should be stronger than a fairy. That just makes sense. So while I do think that kind of taking all of the weight of ability score increases away from the ancestry side of this is a good idea, what I think they should do, and Monty actually brings this up, is they should do a +1 from background, +1 from race or ancestry, and +1 from the class. That way, you have something from your background, from how you grow up, what kind of job you've had. You have something from your genealogy, something that you just genetically have baked into you. And then finally, something about your class, the way you've learned to fight, the magic you've learned, the intellectual growth or wisdom growth that you may have inherited from training for that class profession. So I think it's headed in the right direction, but I don't think we're quite to what it could be. Not yet. The other 2 things I want to go over real quick before we move on from ancestry are, number 1, I like what Monty said about being able to having the option to take traits and feats from multiple different races or ancestries and kind of combine them into your own custom ancestry. So you could be half aquatic elf, half furbolg, and have some aquatic elf traits and some furbolg traits. My concern with this is, how do you make it balanced? There are some ancestries that have more abilities than others, and when that happens, how do you weigh, are the 3 abilities a fairy gets, do they balance or equal to the 8 abilities an elf gets? Now, these aren't exact numbers, I don't know the exact numbers, but the point is, different ancestries have different numbers of abilities that have different mechanical values. So if you do put a system in place where you can make that custom lineage, how do you keep it balanced? That's my only concern, but conceptually, I do think that's something they should try to integrate. There are a lot of players out there that are like, I like both the drow society, and I like the idea of them being a tiefling, or having, maybe their drow bloodline had devil blood put into it somewhere. Somebody slept with a succubus or something, and now there's devil blood in the bloodline. So they are part drow, part tiefling, because it's only on one side of the family. Something like that would be really cool, but 5e doesn't have anything that mechanically takes that into account. The document for OneD&D doesn't really seem to have anything that takes that into account. It's kind of mentioned that it's something you can do, but there's nothing that mechanically separates it from a purebred ancestry. The only other thing I want to touch on are the fact that I think Ardlings are stupid. Not the fact that they exist. I like that there's a catch-all anthropomorphic ancestry, because there are a lot of them already out there. We have the Tabaxi, we have Owlin, we have the rabbit folk, whose name I completely forget. The Haragon, that's what they're called, the Haragon. And then we have a bunch of other ones like the Hippo people, whose name I can't remember, and the Locathal. And there's just so many different animalistic ancestry or races out there. Races, I said that. There's so many of them out there that it makes sense to have one ancestry that's like, this can basically have whatever animalistic traits you want, but if you want to be an animal person, this is what you choose. My issue with it is that they have also included celestial bloodline in it. I hate that for two reasons. Number one, I really, really like the Aesmere. It gives the characters a sense of being tied to the heavens, to the angels themselves, especially through the passive abilities that each of those ancestries have. You have the Protector's ability to fly, the Radiant's ability to basically be a bomb of holy damage, and then the Fallen Aesmere's fear aura. There's so many different cool ideas there that tie them to those angels. But now you've kind of taken them and the anthropomorphic ancestry and mashed them together, and I don't get it. What I really hope they do is, I honestly like the idea of them having the different name. The name Ardling is cool, because then you have Tiefling and Ardling, and they kind of sound more like opposites. But what I would like to have them do is have the Ardling be what the Aesmere was, and then give the anthropomorphic ancestry its own name, its own traits, its own thing. First of all, I think players that have been looking for an anthropomorphic catch-all ancestry like that, or that have been waiting for their favorite animal to have something they can use canonically, they're going to feel a little bit snuffed that it's been combined with these angel powers, and I think that Aesmere players are going to feel the same way. Again, I love the idea of the name change, Ardling instead of Aesmere, but I think Ardling should be what Aesmere was, and anthropomorphic ancestries need to have their own name, their own features. I think that's the way to go. I do want to say, well, I have an issue with the way the backgrounds are written now. They don't have personality traits, ideals, bonds, or flaws written into them anymore. And on one hand, I kind of understand that, just because you don't want to put, these are the only 8 personality traits your character could have, into a player's mind. If you can come up with your own personality traits, your own ideals, your own bonds, your own flaws, it's always better. It's always better to come up with your own character traits than to take something out of the book, unless you're trying to challenge yourself or you're playing a specific kind of campaign. But the problem with it is there's a lot of players like me who will use those for inspiration. Normally when I'll make a character, what I'll do is I'll choose their background and I'll go and I'll roll one each personality trait, ideal, bond, and flaw. And I will try to craft their background, their story, out of what those rolls give me. Now, it doesn't always work, as sometimes I have to re-roll or come up with my own concepts to replace ones that aren't really working with an idea that's forming in my head. But the point is that those are there as a guide to help players who either A, need a little bit of help with coming up with a concept, or B, are trying to challenge themselves in some sort of way. And it really, I don't think, would have been that hard to keep exactly what they were in 5e. It worked. It worked well. And I would urge anybody who's going to be playing OneD&D to use the 5e personality traits, ideals, flaws, and bonds if you are struggling or looking for a challenge. I will say the way the backgrounds are initially presented in the document is very good, because right up front, it says this is how to build your own custom background, and then follows it up with a few examples of how to do it. Now, granted, these examples are a lot of the same ones we have in 5e, like the Acolyte, as Kelly brought up. But Kelly also brought up a point where that you might have a DM who, because you're trying to play the Acolyte background and you want to move where the bonus you're getting to your ability scores are coming from, a DM might still technically be able to say no because you're trying to play the Acolyte that's in the book. But the document very explicitly says that these are just examples. You don't have to even use the name Acolyte. You can change the bonus to a strength bonus and call it a bishop if you want to. It's completely up to you. So I understand where that issue lies, but I would urge any DM that is thinking about ruling it that way to just open your mind to the possibility of the fact that the whole idea behind this game is to use imagination and to let players do what they want to do, play the characters they want to play. And I understand that there's some things you don't want to allow because it's going to break the game, but I really don't think this is going to. Alright, moving on to the next section of the book, I'm going to be talking about feats. The only thing I really want to touch on with feats is I hate that we're getting them at level 1 now. My biggest issue with this is that it's very easy for allowing feats at level 1 to tumble into two different things that can become extremely problematic. Number one, power creep issues further down the line. We're already starting to see issues where older versions of classes or older archetypes aren't holding up to what the new books are releasing. Even the Eldritch Knight Fighter, which is really good, it's a really good class, but it has a hard time holding a candle to some of the classes that have been released in Tasha's because they're just so good. So as the game of D&D continues to exist, we're going to see more and more content start to come out that's going to keep creeping that power of the game further up and further up and further up. We've already got classes like the Paladin and the Fighter and the Rogue that are already really strong at level 1, and now we're going to slap a feat on top of them. Now, on one hand, I kind of understand why some people won't want this because it's a throwback to some older editions. 3rd edition and 3.5 lets you do this where you did start with one basic feat. But, again, as the game gets more and more content and the power level grows and grows and grows, things are going to become harder to balance. It's going to be harder to use older content. It's going to be harder to use older monsters. It's going to be harder to use older campaigns that have been, or modules that you've bought with your money. And even without having those level 1 feats, we already have this problem. So I fear that allowing players to choose feats at level 1 is going to exacerbate this issue. The other thing I'm worried about is that these feats now have level restrictions, some of them, which I do think this is a good thing. I think having level restrictions on some feats is a good idea. Monty even brought up in the video that there's the feat Polearm Master or Great Weapon Master, where Master is literally in the name of the feat. You should not be able to be the master of anything at level 1. It doesn't make sense. So I do agree with level restrictions on feats. That makes sense to me. What I'm afraid of is that this is going to stumble into feat trees. Now, inherently, feat trees are not bad. What feat trees can become is... What do I mean by this? Take a look at 3.5. Anybody who has played 3.5 knows what I'm talking about. The feats in 3.5 are insane. Even the player's handbook has, I think, 70 or 80 of them, if not more. And then each and every supplement that came out has more. There's the complete warrior, the complete divine, the complete arcane, the complete mage, the complete adventurer, the complete scoundrel. There's the drow supplements, the scion supplements. There's the dragonlance supplements. There's so much content, and 3.5 has literally hundreds. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it were thousands of feats. And the reason that is because there's so many different trees, there's so many different feats that chain into this or chain into that, and if you want to have this certain kind of fighting style, you need power attack, 2-weapon fighting, this, that, and the other thing. Granted, the way skill points worked in 3.5 kind of made that more complicated, but if we're not careful, the way the feats work now, if we start implementing feat trees, we might slide back into something similar, some sort of similar issue. I may be a little bit paranoid on this one just because I don't want to see that craziness happen again because it was so difficult to follow and make sure that you were getting the feats you needed when you needed them so that ultimately you were able to have the character you wanted. I think the way feats work right now, as is perfectly fine. And then if you add those level restrictions on top of them, stop there. Call it good. Don't add feat trees, please, I'm begging you. Now, how D20s work and D20 tests is the next thing I want to talk about. First of all, and I'm throwing this in here because in order to crit, you have to roll the D20 to begin with. How they're changing crit damage is stupid. I understand that when the Paladin swings with their Greatsword, dealing 2d6 damage, and they blow a 4th or 5th level Paladin spell slot to deal an additional 68 smite damage, and then they crit, doubling all that, and they've got a fistful of like 15 or 16 dice, you're a little mad they just one-shot your boss. I get it. I've had it happen to me before. However, the new crit rule makes it so that if you crit, you only double the dice of your weapon. So if you crit with a longsword, even if you're a paladin and you're smiting, even if you're a rogue, and you're sneak attacking. Only get an extra d8 of damage. First of all, I feel like this doesn't really give crits the power that they should have. When you crit, that should mean something. An extra d8, I can literally dip into fighter and take an archetype of Psy Warrior and get that exact same effect. I could dip into rogue and get sneak attack and get a d6, and it's as if I crit with a scimitar. I'm not getting anything this way. It doesn't feel as good. Part of the reason players play paladins or play rogues is so that they can get that rush when they do crit and roll that big handful of dice. Everybody loves how that feels, and taking that away is a really bad thing for the game, I think. Not to mention, while I have had paladins and rogues deal a crapload more damage to my bosses than I have ever expected, I have never had the way crits work ruin or derail a game before. I have never said, God damn, that paladin hurts and is completely ruining my story because they smite too hard. I have never said that. I never will. And I don't know any other DMs that ever have. So I really don't understand why we're devaluing the power of the crit. I don't think it's as impactful as people think it is. And I'm not going to be using this rule in my table, even if I do change over to OneD&D. I'm going to continue to use the critical rule that I use now, because even the rules as written 5e crit rule I feel is kind of dumb. If you don't know what crunchy crits are, I would advise also watching Dungeon Juice videos on their homebrew rules, because I got that from them. Now, as far as d20 tests go, basically what that is that instead of having attack rolls, skill checks, and saving throws, you just have a d20 test. Anytime you attack something, or you need to make a saving throw, or you want to use a skill, you roll a d20 and it's called a d20 test. On one hand, I like this, because on any d20 test, attack roll, skill check, or saving throw, a nat 1 is a crit failure, a nat 20 is a crit success. For attack rolls and saving throws, I love this. This is beautiful, because I do think attack rolls, there should be a automatic success and an automatic failure, because in that heat of battle, no matter how good you are at what you do, no matter how good of a warrior you are, there's always the chance to either get lucky or slip up. Same thing goes for saving throws. It's so in the moment that maybe you weren't ready for the telekinetic psychic attack, and now you're being mind blasted way harder than you may have otherwise. Or maybe you saw that trap door and were ready for it, so you have a nice boost on your dexterity saving throw, and you get a crit, and you automatically succeed because you were just that nimble. Where I have an issue is when it comes to skill checks. Skill checks, while they can be used in combat, generally aren't. They're generally used outside of combat for non-combat situations that may be a little bit tense, but the success or failure isn't quite as heated. Granted, a success on a skill check or a failure on a skill check can be extremely impactful. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, generally speaking, in the middle of doing a skill check, the tension isn't usually as high as it will be when you're making an attack roll or a saving throw roll. So you have a little bit more time to focus on the skill at hand and make sure that you are succeeding at it in the way that you want to. At the same time, if you haven't taken proficiency in a skill, you haven't practiced that skill in a single day, there is no way on God's green earth, with the exception of by the grace of the gods themselves, that you should be able to pull it off. I don't care that you hit the 5% chance of rolling a crit on that d20. I am not going to let you scale that smooth 50-foot wall that has absolutely no handholds or footholds. It's not going to happen. So again, while attack rolls and saving throws, I think it makes more sense, because in that minute amount of time that those things occur, anything can happen. You can get lucky. You can slip up. You can, anything can happen. But with skill checks, again, while they can be used in a split moment in combat, they're generally not. And saying that they can automatically succeed or automatically fail, I think does both the players and the GM a disservice, both on a role-playing front for the players and on a mechanical front for the GM. The only other thing I want to say about D20s is I love the new inspiration rule. Mostly because, as a DM, I always forget to give my players inspiration. They always forget to use it. I always forget they have it, and most DMs are the same way. So having it so that players get inspiration whenever they roll the nat 20 makes it easier for both the players and the GM to remember that, first of all, inspiration exists, and second of all, that the players have it. But I do think that it would be a little overpowered if it didn't vanish after a short rest. Making it vanish after a short rest means that if a player gets inspiration and for whatever reason they need to take a short rest, maybe the fighter just needed to heal some hit points with their hit die, or maybe the warlock's out of spell slots, whatever the case may be, if you short rest, you're going to lose that inspiration dice. So while it makes it easier to get and easier to remember that they exist, it also kind of balances them out. And I'll be really interested to see how this ends up playing out at my table. Now, as we all know, OneD&D was announced beside this new virtual tabletop that Wizards of the Coast is creating after having wound up D&D Beyond. Earlier today, I watched Taking 20 Cody's video on basically the fact that he called all of this. All of the releases that they're coming out with, the new material, how they're coming out with the material, the virtual tabletop, the new edition of D&D. Like he said himself, you might as well just call him Nostradamus because he called all this shit. But the part of his video that I want to talk about is where he said that 150 years from now, people won't be playing Dungeons & Dragons on pen and paper. Part of why I want to talk about that is because over at Dungeon Craft, Professor Dungeon Master made a response video to this claim about how he won't be using pen and paper in 150 years. Professor Dungeon Master thinks that we will be using pen and paper come 150 years because there's a certain experience to playing D&D in person that you can't get online. You can't get it digitally, even with webcams and voice cams and things like that. It's a different experience. On one hand, I do agree with Professor Dungeon Master. Playing in person is very different from playing online. When I started 12 years ago playing D&D, I did play in person with my initial parties. My first few parties were all in person. We started with 2nd edition, 3rd edition, and 3.5, and by the time I left them, I was DMing 5th edition. However, after that, it became really difficult to meet up with people full time, so I switched over to digital. And while the experience hasn't been the same, I'm still developing relationships with the people that I'm playing with digitally. We're still becoming friends, and we're still having a friendly, fun experience twice a week for the 2 campaigns that I run. And again, it is a very different experience, but it's not a bad experience. It's just different. And this is true no matter what kind of D&D you play. If you're playing with a virtual tabletop, if you're playing with mats, if you're playing online, if you're playing in person, if you're playing with the 3D tabletop environment that Wizards of the Coast is supposedly coming out with, that's going to be awesome, by the way. Whatever it is, each one of these has their own merits, their own value that contribute to both the game of Dungeons & Dragons and the community around the game at large. So, will we be using pen and paper in 150 years? It's impossible to say. There's a certain faction of D&D players that prefers to play in person. If I was given the choice, I absolutely would. But there's also a group of people that, there's all sorts of social awkwardness with meeting new people. There's the risk of infection and things like that out in public. There's all sorts of different concerns that comes with being out in public to begin with. Then you have the issue of your friends or your family being miles away from each other. Out of the 5 or 6 people that I have playing between the 2 campaigns that I run, 2 of them are in Australia. One of them's in Canada. There's so many different people from around the world that we can play with because we have this digital capability. And again, I don't live in the same state as my brother. He lives 2,000 miles away from me. If I want to play D&D with him, we have to do it virtually. But I would rather have that option available than to not have it at all just because we aren't in person. So again, there's different values to different versions of the game, and I think they all have their own merit that need to be taken into account as we're moving forward. Where I think Wizards of the Coast's head is at is the pen and paper players have their game. We have 1st edition, 2nd edition, Advanced D&D, 3rd edition, 3.5, 4th edition, and 5th edition that can be all played on paper. If you want to play digitally and you want to play Dungeons & Dragons, not other role-playing games, you get 3.5 or 5th edition. That's it. And even that's kind of a struggle because there's a lot of systems out there that aren't set up to integrate 3.5 or aren't set up to integrate 5e because they were made back when 3.5 was the only way to play digitally. So what I think they're doing is they're trying to open up that market to the younger, more digital players so that they can also experience the game they want it to be. So I don't think we need to worry about pen and paper D&D going anywhere anytime soon. It's not like OneD&D coming out. Even if it were completely digital, they were not going to release anything physical, anything paper at all whatsoever. 5th edition isn't going anywhere, guys. Like, we're still going to be able to use the 5th edition books. We're still going to be able to use the 5th edition miniatures. Even if what they're saying about OneD&D being backwards compatible is complete bullshit, it doesn't really matter in the end because, again, those 5e books still exist. Those 5e adventures still exist. Those 3.5 adventures and books still exist. Your imagination still exists. And that's why all of these different ways of playing D&D have merit, because all it really boils down to is two things: personal preference and imagination. As long as you have your personal preference and you're playing the game of D&D you want to play, at that point the only limitation to how much fun you're having with the game is your own creativity. What I think I would like to see if D&D does start to go more towards this digital version that they're going for, is I would like them not to leave the pen and paper players in the dust, because there are a lot of us who prefer to play the pen and paper style of D&D, and I don't think we need to necessarily worry about being left in the dust right now, but moving forward, if we don't start to see some physical supplements at least be available after release or something like that, then we might need to voice up and say something to them. But I think right now there's really no reason to panic, and I think just enjoy what they're trying to do. Like I said at the beginning of the video, for the first time they're asking for assistance. I believe it's the first time. They're asking for feedback from the community about an entire edition of D&D 2 years before they're even planning to release it, much less release it. Now, if anything I've said resonates with you, or if you absolutely abhor anything I said, please let me know in the comments below. I do want to add that I do think we need to be very, 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 very vocal about what we want out of this game. They're saying that it is going to be backwards compatible, and they're pushing it and pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. But I do agree with Lucard over at the DM layer that it seems like they're pushing it a little too much. We've seen it before with other editions of D&D where 3.5 was supposed to be backwards compatible with 3rd edition, and it kind of was. Not really, though, because a lot of the monsters in 3rd edition ended up being really weak to characters that were made with the 3.5 system. There were also a lot of mechanics in 3rd edition that ended up getting left out of 3.5. Stats and abilities and things that just didn't really work with one another. Initially, before they came out with the expanded Psionics handbook, there was a whole list of psionic stuff that just didn't have a home. Mechanically, it didn't make any sense in 3.5. So while, yes, technically 3.5 is backwards compatible 3.E, there's a reason we treat it as two different kinds of editions. They kind of are. So even if this does end up being a 5.5 kind of thing, due to both the fact that it's impossible for it to stay exactly the same, and the fact that there is the undeniable power creep that has been happening with 5th edition and will continue to happen as we move forward with content, I don't think it's going to be as backwards compatible as they're saying. I do agree with Luke. I hope it is. I hope they're right. I hope this is something they actually do end up making backwards compatible, because I don't want to have to upgrade and move up stuff and homebrew it all just to have that same feeling. That's really the last thing that I have to say about OneD&D and the virtual tabletop. I like a lot of the changes that are being made. There's some really ugly stuff I hope they do change, and I hope the virtual tabletop is the first of many improvements to come for the experience of players that are looking to play more digitally. If you agree with that, or if you disagree, or if you want to leave any notes about OneD&D on any of the mechanics or new rules I may not have covered, please leave a comment below. Be sure to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.